So busy getting ready to live, they don't actually ever live. Living to work rather than working to live. Need a car to get to work, to pay for the car that gets you to work. Vicious cycle. I asked one friend who had retired some years ago if he felt that he was still too busy now. Clearly, he said, I don't spend time on the things that I regard as my real priorities. I asked another friend, who I suspected was too busy, if he felt his life was out of control. He replied that his life was totally out of control and had been for as long as he could remember. He had come to the conclusion that he will always figure out a way to keep his head barely above water, if not slightly submerged. Only 2 persons that I talked with said that they didn't feel too busy. One person said he was busy but liked it that way. I was actually a little concerned sometime that he might be too content, could get too relaxed, which he could relax. And he was worried sometime that he might get so relaxed that it was as if he might fall into a hole and never get back to normal American time. The other person I talked to said that she wasn't too busy, but felt guilty sometimes for not being more a part of the frantic pace. I got an image in my mind hearing this. It was of lying on the couch reading while another person is around you trying to vacuum. You feel when you're reading as if perhaps you should be helping out, cleaning, and the other person feels the same way. So what to do? I could give a lot of reasons, but I'm not. I don't have time for that. I've come up with 8 suggestions from my For What It's Worth department. These will assist you in this busy coming year. It's a kind of 8-fold path. They're helpful hints and tips for successful living in a frantically busy culture. And now some of these are going to be directly practical things. Others are going to be more in the line of giving perspective. And let me start with that. It may be helpful to think about time in a modern scientific way, surprisingly perhaps. But to Aristotle and Newton, time was something solid and concrete and absolute and laid out in a linear fashion in front of us. It was independent, time was independent of space, and it was independent of the observer. Now, all of that's changed with Einstein. In Einstein's world, time is not absolute. It's related to space, it's related to the speed we're traveling, and it's related to your perspective as an observer. Stephen Hawking, in the book I mentioned in the reading, A Brief History of Time, writes, "In the theory of relativity, there is no unique, absolute time, but instead, each individual has his own personal measure of time that depends on where he is and how he is moving." Modern physics operates with the notion that we live in a participatory universe. Time there is inseparable from that universe, and it's inseparable from us. And so we might see time, as Marjorie Kelly says, not as a linear path moving toward the future, but rather as the unfolding motion of the whole system. The unfolding motion of the whole system, or the medium in which we can see the movement of the whole system. Now, it takes a while for that to sink in. And even if we can't ever get it completely in our heads, still I think we can imbibe something of the spirit of modern science, namely to become aware that we participate with time, that time unfolds with us, that it's not absolute and it's not outside of us, but we are involved with it. Therefore, it ought not to be our master. It's part of us. Secondly, it might be helpful to recognize that people are different, even within families, different in the ways that they try to manage their time. Some people are list makers. They make master lists and daily lists and priority lists and coded lists. One friend of mine says that he makes lists because he doesn't want to decide emotionally what he's going to do during the day, but he wants to lay it out rationally. If he tried to go by feel and by what he wanted to do, he fears that he would never get to what he actually needs to do. Now, his spouse, on the other hand, operates in exactly the opposite fashion. No lists whatsoever. She goes almost entirely by feel and by letting the energy of the moment decide for her what should be done. She told me that she thinks of herself as a kind of sounding board with a whole system of alarms inside. And when something needs to be done, its energy communicates to her and sets off that alarm. So what needs to get done gets done, but it gets done in its own rhythm and at its own pace and its own time. Another person I spoke to says that he uses a combination of these two methods. One, he makes a list, but he doesn't put it in any order of priority. Instead, he lets the energy of the moment decide what to go with at that particular time. And he doesn't worry if all the things don't get accomplished that he has on that list. Do that tomorrow. Now, a person can get all kinds of books and advice on time management skills and this kind of thing. But in my experience, people are different enough so that they have to devise their own way of working, their own ways of working with time. Now, all of these different ways can work, and of course, all of them don't work too. People who make lists sometimes get governed by those lists, and the lists become their master. People who operate by intuition and by feel find themselves attracted by all kinds of things. They start things, they begin things, they don't finish things, they can't say no to things, and pretty soon their energy is all caught up and they feel harried and distracted and so forth. So people have their own ways of being overly busy. I picked up a cute little aphorism this past week. It's an old Vermont saying. It goes like this: just because a cat gives birth to its kittens in an oven doesn't make them biscuits. You have to think about that for a bit. It's the same as you can't change the stripes on a zebra. In other words, you can't just determine what you want to do when that's not who you are.